Los Angeles in 1992 was a city still bleeding. The riots had torn through neighborhoods just months before, leaving scorch marks on the collective memory and a police department under siege from public scrutiny. The news cycle churned relentlessly through stories of violence and corruption, and in that chaos, it was easy for one missing graduate student to slip through the cracks. Easy for Rachel Morrison to become just another face on a bulletin board at the Foothill Division Station, just another open case file gathering dust in a metal cabinet while detectives chased gang murders and arson investigations. But Rachel's disappearance was never ordinary. From the moment her roommate Sarah Chen reported her missing on October 19th, there were details that didn't fit the standard runaway or accident profile. Details that whispered of something else, something that made even seasoned investigators pause and exchange uncertain glances across interview room tables. Rachel had left their Westwood apartment at 5:45 that Saturday morning, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, "Heading to the hills back by noon, don't eat my leftover pad thai." Sarah had smiled at that note, typical Rachel humor, and gone back to sleep. She worked night shifts at Cedar Sinai and cherished her weekend mornings. When she woke again at 3 in the afternoon and found Rachel's bed untouched, her backpack missing from the hook by the door, she felt the first flutter of concern. By 8 that evening, with darkness settling over the city and still no word, that flutter had become a cold stone of certainty. The LAPD initially treated it as they treated most missing persons cases involving young adults. 24 hours. Wait and see. Probably met a boyfriend, probably stayed out partying, probably forgot to call. Sarah had shouted at the desk sergeant, her voice cracking with frustration. "You don't know her. Rachel doesn't party. Rachel doesn't forget. Rachel keeps schedules like other people keep religion." It was true. Rachel Morrison was a creature of patterns and precision, traits that served her well in her field research. She studied ecosystem recovery in disturbed habitats, spending weeks tracking how native plants reclaimed burned areas, how animal populations shifted and adapted. Her professors at UCLA described her as brilliant and meticulous, the kind of student who submitted field reports that read like poetry, but contained data sets that could withstand any peer review. She had a grant proposal pending with the National Science Foundation. She had a future mapped out in careful detail. She also had a habit that worried her mother back in Portland, Oregon. Rachel liked to hike alone in remote places, seeking what she called the quiet spaces where you can hear the earth breathe. Her mother, Ellen, had pleaded with her to take friends along, to at least tell people exactly where she was going. Rachel would smile and promise, but those who knew her understood she was promising to be careful, not to change her fundamental nature. Solitude was where she did her best thinking, her best work. On October 19th, when the missing persons report was finally filed, Sarah provided the names of Rachel's favorite hiking areas. The San Gabriel Mountains northeast of the city, particularly the trails off Angeles Crest Highway, where chaparral gave way to pine forest at higher elevations, where the city noise faded to wind and bird calls. The rangers at the Angeles National Forest stations were contacted. On October 20th, 2 days after Rachel was last seen, a young ranger named Marcus Vega found her car. The Honda sat alone in a dusty pullout at mile marker 37, where a narrow trail descended into Millard Canyon. The car was locked, no signs of forced entry, no broken glass or disturbed earth around it. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. Rachel's keys were gone, presumably with her. Her wallet was tucked in the glove compartment, which struck the investigators as odd. Who hikes without identification? But her student ID was missing from the wallet, tucked into her jeans pocket perhaps, a habit some hikers maintained in case of emergency. It was the field journal that caught everyone's attention, the open page with the condor sketch, the careful notation about something following deer trails, prints too large and wrong-shaped. And those torn pages, removed so cleanly, it seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Detective Frank Holloway, assigned to the case from the LAPD's Missing Persons Unit, stood beside the Honda in the late afternoon sun and felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle with unease. "What do you make of this?" he asked Marcus Vega, pointing to the handwritten line about the prints. Marcus was 26, new to the Ranger Service, still enthusiastic about every aspect of the job. He leaned in to read the journal entry and frowned. Could be anything. Black bears come through here sometimes, though they're rare this close to the city. Maybe a large dog, someone hiking with their pet off leash. People see tracks in the dirt, and their imagination fills in the rest. She was a biologist, Holloway said, studying ecosystems, animals. Would she mistake a bear print for something else? Marcus hesitated. Probably not. But people see what they want to see sometimes, especially out here alone. The mind plays tricks in the wilderness. Holloway was 53 years old, a detective with 27 years on the force, and he'd heard that phrase before. The mind plays tricks. It was what people said when they couldn't explain something, when the evidence didn't align with comfortable reality. He'd investigated hundreds of missing persons cases, and most had prosaic explanations. Runaways, accidents, voluntary disappearances from debt or bad relationships, sometimes foul play but usually human and understandable in its brutality. This case felt different from the start, though he couldn't articulate why. The search began that afternoon. Rangers, volunteers from local hiking clubs, search and rescue teams with tracking dogs. They worked the trail Rachel most likely took, descending into Millard Canyon, where a seasonal creek ran dry this time of year, between steep rock walls and dense stands of scrub oak and manzanita. The trail was well marked for the first mile, then fractured into numerous deer paths and scramble routes, used by more adventurous hikers seeking solitude or better views. The dogs picked up Rachel's scent immediately at the trailhead, following it down the main path for approximately 3/4 of a mile. Then something happened that the handlers couldn't fully explain. All 3 dogs, experienced German shepherds trained in wilderness tracking, stopped almost simultaneously at a point where the trail curved around a massive boulder covered in lichen. They whined, circled, refused to go forward despite encouragement and commands. One dog, a female named Sage with over 40 successful finds in her career, sat down and howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "That's unusual," the lead handler, a weathered woman named Caroline Porter, told Detective Holloway. "Sage doesn't quit. I've seen her track through water, through thunderstorms, through areas contaminated with diesel fuel. Something here is interfering with her." "Interfering how?" Holloway asked. The October sun was dropping toward the western ridgeline, throwing long shadows across the canyon floor. "I don't know. Could be a strong competing scent. Dead animal nearby, chemical spill, something that overwhelms the target scent, or—" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Or what? Or sometimes they react to predators, mountain lions, bears. If there's a large predator in the area, the dogs can sense it and refuse to enter its territory. It's instinct overriding training." They searched the immediate area carefully. No dead animals, no chemical odors beyond the normal sage and dust smell of chaparral. No scat or territorial markings that would indicate a mountain lion, though Holloway had to admit he wouldn't necessarily know what to look for. They continued on foot without the dogs, calling Rachel's name until darkness forced them back to the trailhead. Over the next 3 days, search teams covered every accessible part of Millard Canyon and the surrounding ridges. They found nothing. No backpack, no clothing, no sign that Rachel had ever descended that trail beyond the point where the dogs stopped. It was as if she'd walked to that specific spot and simply ceased to exist. On the 4th day of searching, a volunteer hiker named Dennis Kowalski made a discovery on a steep hillside about 200 yards off the main trail. He'd been working through a particularly dense thicket of manzanita, the twisted branches catching at his clothes, when he noticed something unusual in the dirt beneath the shrubs. Marks, deep impressions in the hard-packed earth, leading upslope toward a rocky outcropping. "Detective, you need to see this," Dennis called down to where Holloway was coordinating the search grid with rangers. The marks were unlike anything Holloway had seen in 27 years of police work. They were roughly foot-shaped but elongated, measuring approximately 18 inches long and 8 inches across the widest point. Each print showed 4 distinct toe impressions at the front, with what appeared to be claw marks extending an inch or more beyond. The spacing between prints suggested something walking upright with a stride of nearly 5 feet. "Bear?" Holloway asked Marcus Vega, who'd climbed up to examine the tracks. Marcus crouched beside the prints, his face troubled. Wrong shape for bear. Bear prints show 5 toes and they walk more flat-footed. These are... I don't know what these are. The depth suggests something heavy, at least 200 pounds, but the stride length is wrong for any animal I know that walks on 2 legs. Could they be faked? The question came from Sarah Chen, who'd insisted on joining the search despite having no wilderness experience. She stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon sun. "Why would someone fake tracks up here?" Marcus replied. "And how? You'd need to know exactly where the search teams were going to be, and these tracks were under shrub branches that haven't been disturbed in weeks based on the leaf litter." They photographed the prints extensively. A wildlife biologist from the Department of Fish and Wildlife was brought in to examine and cast them. Dr. James Reardon was 60 years old, a specialist in California megafauna, and he spent 2 hours studying the tracks before offering his assessment. "I can't identify these with certainty," he admitted, sitting back on his heels beside the casts. "The size and spacing suggest a large bipedal animal, but we don't have large bipedal animals in California beyond humans. The toe structure is wrong for bear, wrong for any canid or felid, wrong for deer or elk. If I had to guess, I'd say someone wearing modified boots or stilts, but the depth and pressure distribution don't support that theory. The weight is bearing down naturally, not artificially." "So, what's your professional opinion?" Holloway pressed. Dr. Reardon looked uncomfortable. "My professional opinion is that I don't know, and I don't like not knowing. These tracks shouldn't exist, but they do. I'll submit the casts to colleagues, see if anyone has seen anything similar." The discovery of the tracks shifted the investigation's tone. What had been a standard missing hiker case, tragic but comprehensible, became something else. The local news picked up the story, running segments about mystery tracks and wilderness disappearance. The tabloids were more sensational, throwing around words like creature and monster, references to old indigenous legends about wild men in the mountains. The LAPD hated it. Detective Holloway hated it. It turned a serious investigation into a circus, but the tracks were real, documented, cast in plaster, and they led upslope from approximately where Rachel's scent had vanished, climbing into increasingly rugged terrain that few hikers ever attempted. Search teams followed the track line for another quarter-mile before losing it on bare rock. They found 2 more sets of prints beyond that point, both showing the same strange elongated shape, before the trail went completely cold on a windswept ridge overlooking the canyon. On that ridge, they found one more thing. A scrap of green fabric, torn and dirty, caught on a juniper branch about 7 feet off the ground. The forensics team determined it was consistent with Rachel's flannel shirt, the forest green one her roommate confirmed she'd been wearing. How it had gotten 7 feet high was another question, without a comfortable answer. Was it evidence of something pulling her, dragging her upward through the brush? Or had she climbed, fleeing something, and torn her shirt in the process? The investigation continued through November and into December. Detective Holloway interviewed everyone who'd been in the area that October weekend. A rock-climbing group had been working routes in a different canyon 3 miles away. They'd seen nothing unusual, heard nothing, though one climber, a man named Peter Sung, mentioned hearing weird howling on Saturday evening around dusk, a sound he'd attributed to coyotes, though it seemed deeper and more resonant than typical coyote calls. A retired couple who'd been camping near the Angeles Crest Highway reported seeing a large shape moving through the trees on Saturday morning, but they'd been several miles from Rachel's location and admitted their eyesight wasn't what it used to be. It could have been a bear, a hiker, shadows playing tricks. The lack of concrete evidence frustrated everyone. Rachel's mother, Ellen, flew down from Portland and spent weeks walking the trails herself, calling her daughter's name until her voice went hoarse. She gave tearful interviews to local news stations, pleading for information, offering a reward from money she didn't have. Sarah Chen put up missing person flyers from Pasadena to Palmdale, Rachel's face smiling from every grocery store bulletin board and coffee shop window. And slowly, as winter arrived and the case produced no breaks, no body, no resolution, Rachel Morrison joined the ranks of the disappeared. The case remained open, but inactive. Detective Holloway moved on to other investigations, though he kept the file and the strange photographs of those impossible tracks in his desk drawer, pulling them out occasionally when newer cases frustrated him, wondering what he'd missed. The years rolled forward. 1992 became 1995, then 2000, then 2010. Los Angeles changed and evolved, but some things remained constant. Every October, Ellen Morrison would call the LAPD to check if there were any updates. Every October, the answer was no. The case grew colder, the file thicker with dead-end leads and theories that led nowhere. What no one knew in 1992, what couldn't be known until technology and circumstance aligned decades later, was that Rachel Morrison's disappearance was connected to something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Something that would take 33 years and a random DNA database hit to finally bring into the light. Sometimes the truth waits patiently in the dark, and sometimes it's not the truth we expect to find. The passage of time has a way of transforming tragedy into mystery, and mystery into legend. By the mid-2000s, Rachel Morrison's disappearance had become one of those stories that hikers shared on the trail, that true crime forums dissected endlessly, that paranormal enthusiasts cited as evidence of forces beyond understanding. The strange tracks, the torn fabric 7 feet high, the search dogs that refused to continue, these details took on lives of their own, growing and mutating with each retelling, until the truth became impossible to separate from speculation. But for those who'd been there, who'd walked those trails and seen those photographs, the case remained stubbornly real and stubbornly inexplicable. Detective Frank Holloway retired from the LAPD in 2004, 12 years after Rachel vanished. He'd closed hundreds of cases in his career, maintained a solve rate that earned him commendations and respect, but Rachel Morrison's file was one of 3 that he took home in a cardboard box on his last day. Not the official file, that stayed in the records archive, but copies of everything. The photographs, the witness statements, the plaster casts of those impossible tracks, the toxicology reports that showed nothing, the forensic analysis of that green fabric scrap that confirmed it was Rachel's shirt, but couldn't explain how it got 7 feet off the ground. In retirement, Holloway became what he'd always privately disdained, an amateur detective obsessed with cold cases. He spent hours in his home office in Glendale, walls covered with maps and timelines, trying to find patterns that more objective eyes had missed. His wife Margaret worried about him, brought him coffee and sandwiches he barely touched, suggested gently that perhaps some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. "There's always an answer," Holloway would insist, staring at the photographs of those tracks. "Always. We just haven't found it yet." He wasn't the only one who couldn't let go. Marcus Vega, the young ranger who'd found Rachel's car, had risen through the ranks to become a district supervisor for the Angeles National Forest. But he still led training sessions for new rangers at that same trailhead on Angeles Crest Highway, still pointed out the spot where search dogs had refused to continue, still cautioned his staff about the things wilderness could hide. "We get hundreds of missing persons cases in the national forests every year," he'd tell the trainees. "Most are found within 72 hours. They get lost, they get injured, they shelter in place and wait for rescue. But some cases don't follow patterns. Some cases have elements that make you question what you think you know about these mountains. Rachel Morrison's case is one of those. Treat every search seriously, document everything you find, and never assume you understand what happened just because you want closure." In 2008, 16 years after Rachel disappeared, there was a development that briefly reignited interest. A backpacker named Jennifer Ochoa was hiking in the same area of Millard Canyon when she discovered something wedged in a rock crevice about 8 feet off the ground. It was a water bottle, an old Nalgene brand bottle in dark blue plastic, the kind that was ubiquitous among hikers in the 1990s. Inside was a piece of paper, water-damaged and barely legible, with what appeared to be handwriting. Jennifer brought the bottle to the ranger station, and Marcus Vega felt his stomach drop when he saw it. He contacted the LAPD, who in turn contacted Frank Holloway, who drove out to the forest station at speeds that would have earned him a ticket if he'd still been a civilian. The paper was sent to a forensics lab that specialized in document recovery. Using specialized lighting and chemical treatments, they managed to extract a few readable words. The handwriting was compared against samples from Rachel's field journals. It was a match. The partial message read, "Can't keep climbing. Something following. Wrong. Tried to circle back, but the rest was too degraded to recover." The discovery seemed to confirm some aspects of the investigation's initial theories. Rachel had been climbing, trying to escape something or someone. She'd taken time to write a note, perhaps hoping it would be found, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Why climb? Why not stay on the trail where rescue was more likely? What was following her that caused such apparent panic? And how had the bottle ended up 8 feet high in a rock crevice? Had she climbed up and placed it there deliberately, hoping it would be more visible? Or had something else moved it? The renewed investigation in 2008 brought new technology to bear on old evidence. The plaster casts of those strange tracks were examined using 3D scanning and computer analysis. Dr. James Reardon had passed away in 2003, but his successor at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Dr. Yolanda Martinez, conducted a comprehensive review. Her findings were simultaneously more specific and more frustrating. The tracks showed anatomical features consistent with a bipedal stride, weight distribution indicating genuine locomotion rather than artificial fabrication, and a gait pattern that suggested something moving with purpose and control through difficult terrain. But the morphology didn't match any known species, living or extinct, in California's fossil record. If these are genuine animal tracks, Dr. Martinez wrote in her report, they represent something not currently catalogued by science. However, I must emphasize that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and these casts alone, without supporting material such as hair samples, scat, or photographic evidence, cannot definitively prove the existence of an unknown species. The professional skepticism was understandable. The scientific community had been burned before by hoaxes and misidentifications. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, wild men, the Pacific Northwest and California mountains had no shortage of legends, but legends weren't evidence. Still, there were other incidents over the years, small things easily dismissed individually, but forming a pattern when viewed collectively. In 1997, a group of Boy Scouts camping in the San Gabriel foothills reported hearing heavy footsteps circling their camp at night, accompanied by a strong, musky odor they couldn't identify. Their scoutmaster, a man named Robert Chen with 15 years of outdoor experience, told rangers the next morning that whatever had circled them was large enough to snap branches 4 inches thick and confident enough to approach within 20 feet of their fire. In 2003, a solo hiker named Michael Reeves claimed he'd seen something tall and dark moving through the trees on a ridge above Millard Canyon. He'd been hiking at dusk, admittedly not the smartest choice, when he heard rocks tumbling down the slope above him. Looking up, he saw what he described as a massive figure at least 7 or 8 feet tall, moving on 2 legs but hunched forward, covered in dark hair or fur. The sighting lasted only seconds before the figure disappeared into the tree line. Reeves reported it to rangers, but by the time they could investigate the area, any potential evidence had been contaminated by other hikers. In 2011, forestry workers conducting brush clearance after a wildfire found a series of deep scratches on a pine tree approximately 9 feet off the ground. The scratches were parallel, 4 distinct lines gouged into the bark and underlying wood with enough force to expose fresh sapwood. A wildlife biologist examined the marks and admitted they were unusual in height and spacing, but suggested they could have been made by a bear standing on a log or rock that had since been removed or burned. Each incident had a possible explanation. Each could be attributed to misidentification, natural phenomena, or simple human error. But Frank Holloway, reading about each new report from his home office, saw them as pieces of a larger puzzle. He created a map with pins marking every unexplained incident in the San Gabriel Mountains from 1985 to 2015. The concentration of reports centered around Millard Canyon and the surrounding watershed. "Look at this," he told his wife Margaret one evening in 2013, 21 years after Rachel vanished. 17 separate incidents over 30 years, all within a 5-mile radius. Footprints, sounds, sightings, physical evidence. That's not random, that's a pattern. Or its suggestion, Margaret replied gently. She'd learned not to dismiss her husband's obsession, but also to provide the voice of reason he sometimes needed. One story inspires another. People hear about the mystery tracks from 1992, then they're primed to interpret ordinary things as extraordinary when they're in that area. It's confirmation bias. Some of these reports came from professionals, rangers, wildlife biologists, experienced outdoorsmen, who are still human and still subject to perceptual errors. Holloway knew she was right, but he also knew what he felt in his gut. Something had happened to Rachel Morrison in October 1992, something that didn't fit comfortable categories, and whatever it was might still be out there. The years continued their relentless forward march. 2015 became 2020, and the world changed in ways no one anticipated. The pandemic shut down trails and forests, emptied the wilderness of human presence for months. When the trails reopened in 2021, rangers reported an unusual number of wildlife sightings, animals that had grown bolder in human absence, venturing into areas they'd previously avoided. And other things too, more footprints discovered by hikers in remote areas. More stories of sounds in the night, of shapes moving through trees. The Angeles National Forest saw a surge in paranormal tourism, people hoping to glimpse whatever mystery lurked in the canyons. Marcus Vega, now in his mid-50s and contemplating retirement himself, grew increasingly frustrated with the circus atmosphere. "This is a real place where a real person disappeared," he told a particularly aggressive YouTuber who'd been filming without permits. "Rachel Morrison had a family, had friends, had a future. She deserves better than to be turned into content for your channel." Ellen Morrison was 73 years old in 2025, living in a retirement community outside Portland. She'd never stopped hoping for answers, never stopped wondering what had happened to her daughter in those October hills. Every year she made a pilgrimage to Los Angeles, stayed in a modest hotel near UCLA, and walked the trails where Rachel had disappeared. She was older now, slower, needing a walking stick on the steeper sections, but she went. Sarah Chen often joined her, the two women bound together by loss and love for someone who'd been missing longer than she'd been alive. It was Ellen who received the phone call on March 3rd, 2025. She was sitting in her apartment, reading a mystery novel. She'd developed an appetite for them over the years, perhaps seeking in fiction the closure reality denied, when her phone rang with a California area code. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Angela Reyes with the LAPD Cold Case Unit. I'm calling about your daughter, Rachel." Ellen's heart seized. She'd received calls before, false alarms and dead ends, and each one reopened wounds that never fully healed. "Have you found her?" "We've made an arrest," Detective Reyes said carefully. "I can't discuss details over the phone, but I need you to know that we believe we've identified the person responsible for Rachel's disappearance. The case is active again, and there will be criminal charges filed." The room seemed to tilt around Ellen. After 33 years, an arrest. Not closure, not Rachel returned alive. She'd abandoned that hope years ago, but something. Justice, perhaps. Answers, maybe. "Who?" Ellen whispered. "Who did this to my daughter?" "I need you to come to Los Angeles, Mrs. Morrison. There are things you need to hear in person, and they're not simple. This case, it's not what anyone expected." The cryptic words hung in the air. Detective Reyes provided details about flights and arrangements, promised that the LAPD would support Ellen through whatever came next, but offered no further information about the arrest itself. When Ellen hung up, she sat in silence for a long time. Outside her window, Portland rain fell steadily, the same rain that had been falling the day she'd last seen Rachel, when her daughter had hugged her goodbye after a weekend visit and driven back to Los Angeles full of excitement about her research and her future. That night, the news broke. Local LA stations ran segments about a major development in the decades-old cold case. National outlets picked it up, intrigued by the timeline and the mystery. The headlines varied but shared common elements. 1992 cold case solved, arrest made in decades-old disappearance, DNA evidence cracks mystery case. But there was one detail that appeared in several reports, a detail that would dominate speculation and analysis in the days ahead. The person arrested in connection with Rachel Morrison's disappearance had been living in plain sight for over 30 years, had been interviewed during the original investigation, and had passed that interview without raising any suspicion. The arrest came not from new witness testimony or confession, but from genetic genealogy, the same technology that had solved the Golden State Killer case and dozens of others. A DNA sample from Rachel's case, preserved carefully for 3 decades in an evidence locker, had finally found a match. But when investigators followed that genetic trail to its source, what they discovered challenged everything the original investigation had assumed. The identity of the suspect and the story it revealed was something that would shock California and leave even veteran cold case detectives struggling to reconcile evidence with explanation. Frank Holloway heard the news on CNN while eating dinner. He dropped his fork, stared at the television, and felt tears stream down his face for the first time since his father's funeral 40 years earlier. "They got him," he whispered. "After all this time, they got him." But Margaret, watching her husband's face, saw something beyond relief. She saw confusion, saw questions forming, saw the same expression he'd worn for 23 years whenever he looked at those photographs of impossible tracks. "Frank, what is it?" "I don't know," he admitted. "The news said DNA match, but they're not releasing the suspect's name yet. There's something they're not telling us. Something about this case that's still wrong." He was right to sense it, because the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove that sometimes reality is stranger than any legend, and sometimes the monster is exactly who you'd never expect. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office scheduled a press conference for March 5, 2025, 2 days after the arrest. The delay was strategic, giving prosecutors time to prepare their case and brief the family, but it also allowed speculation to reach fever pitch. Internet forums exploded with theories. Podcasters worked overtime analyzing the case. Everyone had an opinion about what the DNA evidence revealed, who the suspect might be, and what had really happened in those October hills 33 years ago. Ellen Morrison flew into LAX on March 4th. Sarah Chen picked her up, the 2 women embracing in the arrivals terminal while photographers from local news stations captured the moment. They'd learned long ago that Rachel's case attracted media attention, and they'd become reluctant experts at navigating it. At LAPD headquarters downtown, Detective Angela Reyes waited in a conference room with several boxes of files, a laptop computer, and the weight of truth she was about to deliver. Reyes was 42, a veteran of the cold case unit who'd helped solve 17 previously unsolvable cases using genetic genealogy. She'd seen families receive answers after decades of uncertainty, had watched people process revelations that shattered their understanding of events. But this case was different. This case had elements that made even her question the boundaries between possible and impossible. When Ellen and Sarah entered the conference room, they found others already there. Frank Holloway, now 76 years old, sitting with his wife Margaret. Marcus Vega, the ranger who'd found Rachel's car, now months from retirement. And a woman Ellen didn't recognize, Dr. Catherine Wells, a forensic geneticist from a private lab that specialized in cold case DNA analysis. "Thank you all for coming," Detective Reyes began. "What I'm about to share is complex and frankly unprecedented. Some of what you'll hear will be difficult to accept. I ask that you listen to everything before asking questions." She opened her laptop and projected an image onto the screen mounted on the wall. It showed a family tree, the kind of genealogical chart that had become familiar from other high-profile cases solved through DNA analysis. In 1992, investigators collected extensive evidence from Rachel's car, from the hiking trail, and from the locations where her water bottle and fabric scrap were found. Among that evidence were several samples of biological material, hair fibers that didn't match Rachel, skin cells recovered from her car's door handle, and trace biological evidence from the water bottle. At the time, DNA technology was in its infancy. The samples were preserved but couldn't be fully analyzed with 1992 capabilities. Ellen leaned forward, her hands gripping Sarah's. "You found whose DNA?" "Over the past 3 years, we've been systematically reprocessing evidence from unsolved cases using modern techniques. Rachel's case was prioritized because of the quality of the preserved samples. Dr. Wells, Would you explain the technical aspects? Dr. Wells stood, clicking to a new slide showing DNA sequencing data. We extracted viable DNA from 3 separate samples collected in October 1992. The profile was male, which immediately gave investigators a suspect profile. We uploaded this profile to GEDmatch and other genetic genealogy databases in January 2025. Within 2 weeks, we had a hit, a third cousin match that allowed us to build a family tree and identify potential suspects. The genetic genealogy led us to a family with roots in Southern California, Detective Reyes continued. Through extensive investigation, we narrowed the pool to one individual who was in the Los Angeles area in October 1992, who had previous connections to the San Gabriel Mountains, and who had opportunity and potential motive. The next slide showed a driver's license photograph. Ellen gasped. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. The face looking out from the screen was familiar. Not intimately familiar, but recognizable from the original investigation. His name was David Sheridan, and in 1992 he'd been a maintenance worker for the Angeles National Forest, responsible for trail upkeep and facility repairs. He was 31 years old then, a quiet man who kept to himself, who'd been interviewed briefly by Detective Holloway because he'd been working in the Millard Canyon area that October weekend. "I remember him," Holloway said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "I spoke with him for maybe 20 minutes. He said he'd been working on a footbridge repair about 2 miles from where Rachel's car was found. He seemed cooperative, had no criminal record, gave us his schedule. There was nothing that raised red flags." His schedule was verified at the time, Reyes confirmed. He signed in at the ranger station on Friday afternoon, signed out Saturday evening. His supervisor confirmed he'd completed the work assigned. Everything checked out, so he was eliminated as a person of interest. "But the DNA says otherwise," Dr. Wells interjected. "The samples we tested matched David Sheridan with a certainty of 99.97%. His DNA was in Rachel's car, on her water bottle, and on organic material found at the site where those unusual tracks were photographed." The room fell silent. Ellen was crying quietly, tears streaming down her weathered face. After 33 years of not knowing, of wondering, of hoping against hope that her daughter might somehow still be alive, this was the answer. Not the answer she'd wanted, but an answer nonetheless. "Where is he now?" Ellen asked. "In custody," Reyes said. "He was arrested at his home in Azusa on March 3rd. He's being held without bail pending formal charges. The DA will announce those charges at tomorrow's press conference." "What's he saying?" Holloway demanded. "Is he confessing? What's his explanation for how his DNA ended up on her belongings?" Detective Reyes exchanged glances with Dr. Wells before answering. "That's where this case becomes complicated. David Sheridan has made statements to his attorney that are frankly difficult to categorize. He's not denying the DNA evidence, but his explanation for how it got there is something we're still working to verify or refute." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "It means," Reyes said carefully, "that he's claiming he encountered Rachel Morrison on that Saturday in October 1992, that there was an interaction between them, but he insists he didn't harm her. He's claiming someone, or something, else was responsible for her disappearance." Marcus Vega leaned back in his chair, recognition dawning on his face. "He's blaming the tracks, the unidentified footprints. He's saying something else took her." "In essence, yes," Reyes confirmed. His attorney has advised him not to make detailed statements, but in initial interviews, Sheridan claimed he witnessed Rachel being taken by something he describes as not human, not animal, something in between. He says his DNA is on her belongings because he tried to help her, tried to intervene, but was unable to stop what happened. The room erupted in reactions. Holloway swore loudly. Sarah made a sound of disgust. Ellen just shook her head, exhausted by the cruelty of it, to finally have a suspect only to have him offer an explanation that sounded like the worst kind of excuse. "That's insane," Holloway said flatly. "He's playing on the mythology around this case, the stories about mystery creatures and unexplained tracks. It's a defense strategy, nothing more. His DNA is on the victim's belongings because he killed her." "That's certainly one interpretation," Reyes agreed. And it's the interpretation the DA's office is proceeding with. We have physical evidence linking Sheridan to Rachel. We have opportunity, and we have suspicious behavior. He never came forward in 33 years, despite knowing his DNA was likely at the scene. That suggests consciousness of guilt. But Margaret Holloway spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but perceptive. She'd spent 50 years married to a detective and had learned to hear the unspoken qualifications in case discussions. But there are aspects of Sheridan's account that are troubling, Reyes admitted. In his initial interview before his attorney shut down questioning, he provided details about that day that we've been able to partially verify through the evidence. He described Rachel's green flannel shirt accurately. He knew about the water bottle, though that detail was never released to the public, and he described the location where the fabric scrap was found, 7 feet up in a juniper tree, before we mentioned it. He could have been there, Holloway argued. He could have torn her shirt, placed the water bottle, created the entire scene. Yes, except his description of how the shirt got into the tree doesn't match human capability. He claims he saw it happen, saw Rachel being lifted, by something that carried her up the slope toward the ridge. He says he followed, tried to intervene, and that's when he touched her water bottle, picking it up from where she'd dropped it, trying to use it as evidence of what was happening. Dr. Wells brought up another slide, this one showing microscopic imagery. This is where the science becomes interesting. When we analyzed the DNA samples more closely, we found something unexpected. Sheridan's DNA on the water bottle is mixed with another biological sample, cells that we initially couldn't identify. They're not human, not from any known animal in our reference databases. The cellular structure is unusual, showing characteristics that don't fit established taxonomic categories. The room went very quiet. "What are you saying?" Ellen whispered. "I'm saying that there was a third party present at some point during the events of October 17, 1992, Dr. Wells explained. Something that left biological traces we can't identify. This doesn't exonerate Sheridan. His DNA is still present, still links him to the scene, but it does suggest the situation may have been more complex than a straightforward abduction or murder." Marcus Vega stood and walked to the window, looking out over downtown Los Angeles. "I've spent 33 years managing forests, training rangers, teaching wilderness safety. I've seen bears, mountain lions, bobcats, every predator native to California. I've investigated dozens of missing persons cases, and I've never stopped thinking about those tracks, those impossible tracks that led up the slope from where Rachel vanished." He turned back to face the room. "In 2008, we found more tracks in a different part of the forest. In 2015, more still. Always the same basic morphology, elongated, bipedal, too large for any known species. We've had sightings reported by credible witnesses, Forest Service personnel, wildlife biologists. Things we've documented but never publicized because we couldn't explain them and didn't want to sound insane." "Are you suggesting," Holloway said carefully, "that there's actually something out there? Something that's not human and not a known animal?" "I'm suggesting," Marcus replied, "that the wilderness is larger and less understood than we like to believe. And that maybe, just maybe, David Sheridan is telling a version of the truth, however impossible it sounds." Detective Reyes pulled up another file on her laptop. "After we arrested Sheridan, we obtained a warrant to search his home. We found journals, dozens of them, spanning 33 years. He's been documenting what he calls encounters in the San Gabriel Mountains. Sightings, sounds, evidence. He's been tracking something he believes has been living in those mountains for decades, possibly longer." She clicked through photographs of journal pages, showing sketches and notes in precise handwriting, drawings of footprints matching the casts from 1992, descriptions of sounds, deep howls that resonated through canyons, the crack of heavy branches snapping. Notes about missing hikers over the years, 9 names besides Rachel Morrison, all people who'd vanished in the same general area and were never found. Sheridan claims he's been trying to understand what happened to Rachel, trying to gather evidence to prove his story, Reyes continued. He says he didn't come forward because he knew no one would believe him, that he'd be arrested for her disappearance. So instead he spent 3 decades documenting everything he could find, hoping that eventually the truth would emerge. Or, Sarah Chen said, her voice hard with anger. He's a murderer who spent 33 years constructing an elaborate fantasy to justify what he did. A man who killed my best friend and then had the audacity to turn her death into some kind of cryptozoology project. The room divided along invisible lines. Those who wanted to believe in evidence and rational explanation, and those who'd seen enough inexplicable things in these mountains to wonder if reality was more complex than comfort allowed. Ellen Morrison spoke, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who'd spent 33 years in limbo. What evidence is there that my daughter is dead? Have you found remains? Anything definitive? No, Reyes admitted. The searches in 1992 and subsequent years found nothing. No body, no burial site, no definitive proof of death beyond the blood evidence on the fabric scrap, which was Rachel's blood type but, given the technology of the time, couldn't be definitively confirmed as hers through DNA. So she could still be alive. The hope in Ellen's voice broke Holloway's heart. Ellen, he said gently, it's been 33 years, without food, water, shelter. I know, Ellen interrupted. I know the statistics, Frank. I've known them for 3 decades. But until someone shows me proof that Rachel is dead, a part of me will always wonder. Detective Reyes closed her laptop. The DA will file charges tomorrow. Most likely murder in the 2nd degree, possibly manslaughter depending on what Sheridan's attorney negotiates. The case will go to trial unless there's a plea agreement. His journals, his DNA, his presence at the scene, all of that will be presented as evidence. What the defense presents, how they frame his explanation, that remains to be seen. What about the unidentified DNA? Dr. Wells asked. The biological sample that doesn't match any known species. We're running additional tests, Reyes said, consulting with experts in wildlife biology, primatology, even extinct species specialists. If it turns out to be contamination or a known animal we simply haven't identified yet, that will be noted. If it remains unidentified, she trailed off. Then what? Marcus pressed. Then it becomes a footnote in a criminal case, Reyes said bluntly, an interesting anomaly that doesn't change the fundamental facts. David Sheridan's DNA is on the victim's belongings. He had opportunity and access. He kept silent for 33 years. Those are the facts that will matter in court. The meeting broke up slowly. Ellen asked for copies of everything she was allowed to see, determined to understand every detail of what had happened to her daughter. Sarah sat with her, the two of them going through photographs and reports, with the grim determination of people who'd been waiting too long for answers. Frank Holloway pulled Detective Reyes aside as people were leaving. What do you really think happened up there? Reyes looked at the old detective, saw the weight of decades in his eyes, and decided on honesty. I think David Sheridan encountered Rachel Morrison on that trail. I think something happened, something violent or frightening. His DNA proves he touched her belongings. Beyond that, she shook her head. I've worked cold cases for 15 years, Frank. I've seen evidence that contradicts logic, cases that don't resolve cleanly, truth that looks like fiction. This case has elements that don't fit any pattern I know. Those tracks, that unidentified DNA, the way evidence was distributed across an impossible terrain. Something happened up there that wasn't simple or straightforward. But the DA thinks they can convict him. The DA thinks the evidence is sufficient for a jury to conclude Sheridan is responsible for Rachel's disappearance and presumed death. Whether that's the complete truth, Reyes shrugged. Maybe we'll never know the complete truth. That night, Frank Holloway couldn't sleep. He lay in bed beside Margaret, staring at the ceiling, thinking about 33 years of questions. At 2 in the morning, he got up and went to his office, pulling out the old files he'd kept all these years. The photographs of those tracks, impossibly large, impossibly shaped. The measurements that didn't match any known species. The reports from credible witnesses who'd seen things they couldn't explain. What if David Sheridan was telling the truth? Not the complete truth, perhaps. His DNA proved his involvement, but a version of truth that included something beyond normal understanding. What if something did live in those mountains? Something that had learned to hide from human observation, something that occasionally crossed paths with hikers who wandered too far into the wild spaces. And what if Rachel Morrison had been one of those unlucky crossings, with David Sheridan as witness rather than perpetrator? The questions had no comfortable answers, but they lingered in the dark hours of morning, persistent as the footprints in the canyon dirt that had never been satisfactorily explained. The press conference on March 5, 2025, drew national media attention. District Attorney Rebecca Thornton stood at a podium bristling with microphones, flanked by Detective Angela Reyes and LAPD Chief of Police Martin Chavez. Behind them, projected on a screen, was Rachel Morrison's smiling face from her UCLA student ID photo, forever 23, forever caught in a moment before everything changed. Today, we announce formal charges in the 1992 disappearance of Rachel Elena Morrison, DA Thornton began, her voice carrying the weight of prosecutorial authority. David Allen Sheridan, age 64, has been charged with second-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. This arrest represents the culmination of 33 years of investigation, hundreds of hours of forensic analysis, and the persistence of detectives who never gave up on finding justice for Rachel and her family. The DA outlined the evidence methodically. The DNA matches, the verified presence at the scene, the suspicious silence spanning 3 decades. She showed photographs of the journals seized from Sheridan's home, describing them as a disturbing chronicle of obsession with the victim and the location of her disappearance. She did not mention the unidentified biological samples. She did not discuss the impossible tracks or the witness reports of strange encounters in the mountains. Those details didn't fit the narrative of a straightforward prosecution. When reporters asked about Sheridan's defense claims, rumors had already leaked about his story of something else being responsible. DA Thornton was dismissive. The defendant will have every opportunity to present his version of events in court. However, no amount of storytelling can overcome the physical evidence linking him directly to the victim and the crime scene. But away from the press conference, in interview rooms and attorney offices and forensic laboratories, the story was more complex. David Sheridan's defense attorney was a woman named Patricia Mendez, a seasoned criminal defense lawyer who'd made her reputation taking difficult cases that other attorneys avoided. When she first heard Sheridan's account of what had happened in October 1992, her initial reaction was to advise him to plead guilty and hope for leniency. The story sounded insane, unprovable, the kind of narrative that would make a jury laugh before convicting. But then she reviewed the evidence files. She saw the photographs of those tracks. She read Dr. Wells's analysis of the unidentified biological material. She interviewed Marcus Vega and other Forest Service personnel about the decades of unexplained incidents in the San Gabriel Mountains. And slowly, reluctantly, she began to wonder if her client might be telling a truth that reality simply wasn't prepared to accommodate. "I need you to understand," she told Sheridan during a jail consultation in mid-March, "that even if every word you've said is accurate, even if something did attack Rachel Morrison and you tried to help her, the jury will not believe it. They can't. It's too far outside normal experience. They'll see a man who was present at the scene, who touched the victim's belongings, who kept silent for 33 years, and they'll conclude you're guilty of her death." Sheridan was a slight man, weathered by decades of outdoor work, with grey hair and brown eyes that held a haunted quality. He'd been a maintenance worker, a solitary person who preferred trees to people, and now he sat in an orange jail jumpsuit, facing the destruction of whatever remained of his life. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for 33 years that no one would believe me. That's why I stayed silent. But I can't let Rachel's mother think I murdered her daughter. I can't let history record that as truth. Even if it costs me everything, the real story needs to be told." "Then tell it to me," Patricia said. "All of it, no matter how impossible it sounds." And so David Sheridan told the story of October 17, 1992, a story he'd carried alone for 33 years, a story that would ultimately challenge everyone who heard it to decide what they believed about the nature of reality and the secrets wilderness could keep. He'd been working on a footbridge repair in a side canyon about 2 miles from Millard Canyon, he explained. The work was routine, replacing rotted planks, reinforcing support beams. He'd arrived early Saturday morning, planning to finish by afternoon. Around 9 o'clock, he'd heard sounds from the ridge above, rocks tumbling, branches snapping, and something else. a vocalization he couldn't categorize. Deep, resonant, something between a growl and a call. As a Forest Service worker, Sheridan knew the sounds of local wildlife. This wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't coyotes, or any other predator he recognized. It raised the hairs on his neck, triggered something primal in his brain that said predator, danger, run. But he was curious too, trained to investigate unusual occurrences in the forest. He'd set down his tools and climbed toward the ridge, moving carefully through dense chaparral. That's when he'd seen Rachel Morrison for the first time. She was approximately 200 yards away, standing on a deer trail that wound up the slope. She had a backpack, was wearing a green flannel shirt, and appeared to be sketching something in a notebook. She seemed completely unaware of the sounds that had drawn Sheridan's attention. Then he'd seen the other shape. It was upslope from her, Sheridan told Patricia, his voice steady despite the impossibility of what he was describing. Moving through the manzanita, staying low but covering ground fast, huge. I've seen bears in these mountains, and this was bigger, taller when it stood up. 7, maybe 8 feet, dark hair or fur covering its body, moving on 2 legs like a person but hunched forward, arms longer than human proportions. He'd shouted a warning, Sheridan said, yelled at Rachel to run to get back to the main trail. She'd heard him, turned, and that's when she'd seen it too. The thing upslope, now standing fully upright, watching her with what Sheridan described as intelligence, not animal instinct, but awareness. Rachel had run. Not down toward Sheridan, but laterally across the slope, perhaps trying to reach higher ground where she could see better, could navigate better. The creature had pursued. Despite its size, it moved with shocking speed and agility through terrain that would have slowed a human. Sheridan had followed, crashing through brush, trying to close the distance. He'd seen Rachel stumble, drop her water bottle, keep running. He'd seen the creature closing in, its long arms reaching. He'd heard Rachel scream, a sound that still echoed in his nightmares. By the time he reached the spot where she'd dropped the water bottle, she was 30 yards ahead, and the creature was almost on her. He'd picked up the bottle, thinking absurdly that it might be evidence, proof of what was happening. Then he'd continued pursuit, watching helplessly as the creature reached Rachel near a cluster of juniper trees. What happened next was burned into Sheridan's memory. The creature had grabbed Rachel. He saw its arm covered in dark hair wrap around her waist, and lifted her with apparent ease. Rachel had struggled, torn free partially, her shirt catching on a juniper branch and ripping as the creature pulled her upward. Then they disappeared over the ridgeline into a rocky area where Sheridan couldn't follow without climbing equipment. He'd stood there, shaking, terrified, holding Rachel's water bottle and staring at the scrap of green fabric hanging 7 feet up in the juniper tree. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 5 minutes. "Why didn't you call for help immediately?" Patricia asked. "Why didn't you report what you'd seen?" "I was in shock," Sheridan admitted, "and I knew how it would sound. I'd just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. If I called rangers, called police, told them a monster had taken a hiker, they'd think I was insane or guilty. I'd touched her water bottle, my DNA would be on it. I'd been at the scene. Every piece of evidence would point to me." So instead, he'd made what he acknowledged was a terrible decision. He'd set down the water bottle where he'd found it, hoping it might be discovered during a search. He'd returned to his work site, gathered his tools, and driven back to the ranger station. He'd signed out on his timesheet like it was a normal day, even though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. When he'd heard about Rachel's disappearance on the news, heard about the search efforts, he'd wanted to come forward, but fear paralyzed him. Fear of being arrested, of being blamed for something he'd tried to prevent. So he'd stayed silent, and that silence had become its own prison. "For 33 years I've lived with this," Sheridan said. "I've gone back to those mountains hundreds of times, trying to find evidence, trying to understand what that thing was. I've documented everything I could find, tracks, signs, reports from other people who'd seen things. I thought maybe if I gathered enough proof, someone would eventually believe me. Someone would understand that Rachel Morrison didn't die because of human evil. She died because she was in the wrong place when something ancient and wild was hunting." Patricia Mendez listened to all of this and faced a professional crisis. Her client's story was either the ravings of a delusional murderer constructing an elaborate excuse, or it was the truth, a truth that would require the justice system, the scientific community, and society at large to accept that something unexplained lived in the mountains outside Los Angeles. The decision of how to proceed came down to the evidence, and the evidence, frustratingly, pointed in multiple directions. Dr. Catherine Wells continued analyzing the unidentified biological samples. She consulted with geneticists at Stanford, primatologists who'd worked with great apes in Africa, even paleogeneticists who specialized in extinct species. The results were consistently baffling. The DNA shows markers consistent with primate evolution, Dr. Wells reported in late March, but the specific combinations don't match any known species, living or extinct. It's not human, not chimpanzee, not gorilla, not any catalogued primate. The cellular structure suggests something that diverged from known evolutionary lines hundreds of thousands of years ago. Could it be contamination? Detective Reyes asked. Sample degradation over 33 years? We've considered that, Dr. Wells said, but contamination would show as bacterial or fungal DNA. This is distinctly mammalian, distinctly primate-related. And it was found mixed with both Rachel's DNA and Sheridan's on the water bottle, suggesting all three were in contact with that object within a short time window. The implications hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. 3 entities had touched that water bottle in October 1992. Rachel Morrison, David Sheridan, and something that science couldn't categorize. Meanwhile, Frank Holloway conducted his own investigation. At 76, he had no official authority, but he had contacts throughout law enforcement and the freedom of retirement. He interviewed everyone connected to the original case who was still alive. He hiked the trails himself, moving slowly with a walking stick, but determined to see the locations again with fresh eyes. On a cool morning in early April, he stood at the spot where the search dogs had refused to continue in 1992. Marcus Vega stood beside him, the 2 old men looking up the slope toward where the strange tracks had been found. What do you think really happened? Marcus asked. Holloway was quiet for a long time before answering. I think David Sheridan is telling the truth as he understands it. I think he encountered Rachel Morrison. I think something happened that terrified both of them, and I think she disappeared in a manner he couldn't prevent and couldn't explain. Does that mean there's actually some unknown creature living in these mountains? He shrugged. 33 years ago I would have said absolutely not. Now, I don't know what's possible anymore. They hiked together to the ridge where the fabric scrap had been found, where Rachel's shirt had torn on the juniper branch 7 feet off the ground. The tree was still there, gnarled and twisted by decades of wind and weather. Holloway stood beneath it, looking up at where the fabric had hung. If she was running, fleeing something, could she have climbed up here? He wondered aloud. Possibly, Marcus said, but why? Climbing a tree doesn't help you escape a mountain lion or bear. They can climb too, and if she was fleeing another human, climbing would trap her. Unless she was being carried, Holloway said quietly. Lifted by something tall enough and strong enough that her shirt caught on a branch at 7 feet, because that's where her body was when whatever held her moved past this tree. The 2 men looked at each other, the weight of implications settling between them. The trial was scheduled for September 2025, but in July something happened that changed the trajectory of the case dramatically. A backpacker named Jennifer Wu was hiking in the San Gabriel Mountains, approximately 4 miles from Millard Canyon, when she discovered something in a shallow ravine. Bones, partially covered by years of accumulated leaf litter and debris. She reported the find to rangers, who contacted the LAPD. The forensic anthropology team that examined the remains determined they were human, female, consistent with a person in their early 20s. Dental records confirmed what everyone had already suspected. Rachel Morrison had been found. The bones told a story. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Richard Yamada, documented multiple fractures consistent with a fall or impact from significant height. Several ribs broken, left femur fractured, skull showing trauma that would have been immediately fatal. But there were other marks too, on the long bones of the arms and legs. Scoring, scratches, patterns that Dr. Yamada described in his report as consistent with large animal predation. though the specific morphology doesn't match known California predators. Most significantly, the bones were discovered in a location that would have been nearly impossible for a human to carry a body. The ravine was accessible only by technical climbing or by descending from the ridge above, a descent that would require climbing down a 60-foot vertical rock face. If David Sheridan killed Rachel Morrison, Patricia Mendez argued in a motion filed with the court, how did her body end up in a location he couldn't have accessed without specialized equipment? The forensic evidence shows she fell or was dropped from above. The only way to reach the ridge above that ravine is through terrain that requires technical climbing skills. Mr. Sheridan has no such skills, no equipment, and no plausible way to have moved a body to that location. The DA's office countered that Sheridan could have had an accomplice, could have used equipment he later disposed of, could have taken routes through the mountains that were no longer obvious 33 years later. But the arguments sounded weak, even to prosecutors. In late August, the DA's office offered a plea deal: voluntary manslaughter with an agreed sentence of 8 years, credit for time served. Sheridan would be eligible for parole in 4 years. The alternative was going to trial and potentially facing life imprisonment if convicted of second-degree murder. It was Ellen Morrison who made the decision that ultimately resolved the case. She met with David Sheridan in jail, a meeting arranged through Patricia Mendez and attended by Sarah Chen and Detective Reyes. Ellen looked at the man accused of killing her daughter and asked him directly, "Did you harm Rachel?" "No, ma'am," Sheridan said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I tried to save her. I've spent 33 years wishing I'd been faster, stronger, braver. I've lived with the guilt of surviving when she didn't, of staying silent when I should have spoken. But I didn't harm her. I swear on everything I value, I didn't harm your daughter." Ellen studied his face for a long moment. She'd spent 33 years learning to read people, to distinguish truth from comfortable lies. She saw pain in David Sheridan's eyes, guilt and grief and terrible knowledge, but she didn't see the coldness of a killer. "I believe you," she said finally. "I don't understand what happened in those mountains, and maybe I never will. But I believe you tried to help Rachel. I believe something took her that day, something you couldn't stop." The plea deal was rejected. Instead, Ellen Morrison, through her attorney, submitted a victim impact statement requesting that the DA's office drop the charges. She cited the physical evidence, the impossibility of Sheridan accessing the location where Rachel's remains were found, the unidentified DNA, the pattern of injuries suggesting something beyond human capability. The DA's office faced a decision. They could proceed to trial with a weakening case and a victim's family publicly declaring they believed the defendant was innocent, or they could acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that this case had elements that didn't fit standard criminal prosecution. On September 15, 2025, the charges against David Sheridan were formally dropped. The DA issued a statement saying that, while evidence linked Sheridan to the scene, the totality of circumstances, including the discovery of remains in an inaccessible location and the victim's family's position, created reasonable doubt that precluded successful prosecution. David Sheridan walked out of jail after 6 months in custody, blinking in the September sunlight, a free man carrying the weight of an impossible story. The case officially remained open, classified as death by misadventure with unknown contributing factors. The LAPD's final report acknowledged the presence of unidentified biological material at the scene, but drew no conclusions about its source or significance. The media coverage was intense for weeks, then gradually faded as new stories captured public attention. Rachel Morrison's case became another unsolved mystery, another story told on podcasts and internet forums, debated endlessly by those who sought simple answers in a world that didn't always provide them. Ellen Morrison returned to Portland with her daughter's remains. The funeral was held in early October 2025, 33 years and 2 weeks after Rachel disappeared. She was buried in a cemetery overlooking the Columbia River, her headstone reading, "Rachel Elena Morrison, 1969-1992, forever seeking the quiet places." At the funeral, Frank Holloway gave a brief eulogy. "Rachel Morrison was taken from life at 23 years old," he said. "How she was taken, and by what we may never fully understand. But I've learned in my years that truth is often more complex than we want it to be. The mountains keep their secrets. The wilderness operates by rules we don't fully comprehend. Rachel ventured into that wilderness with courage and curiosity, and she deserves to be remembered for those qualities, not just for the mystery of her passing. Sarah Chen planted a California condor lily, Rachel's favorite wildflower, on the grave. She'd spent 33 years without her best friend, and now she had closure of a sort, even if the full story remained elusive. David Sheridan never gave media interviews. He returned to his home in Azusa, returned to work maintaining trails in the Angeles National Forest. But he continued his documentation, continued recording evidence of the thing he'd seen in the mountains. His journals grew thicker, his collection of plaster casts and photographs more extensive. In November 2025, Marcus Vega retired from the Forest Service. On his last day, he hiked to Millard Canyon one final time, standing at the trailhead where Rachel's car had been found 33 years earlier. The mountains rose around him, covered in chaparral and pine, holding secrets in their ancient stone and dark canyons. He thought about all the missing persons cases over the years, the 9 other names David Sheridan had documented in his journals, people who'd vanished without trace in the same general area. He thought about the tracks, the sightings, the sounds in the night that defied explanation, and he thought about the question that had haunted him for 33 years. What else lived in these mountains that humanity had never fully catalogued, never fully understood? On a ridge above Millard Canyon, something moved through the trees in the fading afternoon light. Large, bipedal, covered in dark hair. It paused at the edge of the tree line, looking down at the lone figure standing at the trailhead far below. Then it turned and disappeared into the wilderness, into the vast, roadless areas where satellites don't show details and human presence is measured in days per year, rather than people per day. The San Gabriel Mountains contain approximately 1,000 square miles of forest, canyon, and alpine terrain. Much of it is rarely visited, understood only in general terms by those who manage it. The wilderness is not empty. It teems with life, with ecosystems and predator-prey relationships and behaviors that occur far from human observation. And sometimes, perhaps, it contains things that have learned to hide, to avoid, to exist in the spaces between human knowledge and human presence. Rachel Morrison's case was officially closed in January 2026 when the final forensic reports were filed. The cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries consistent with a fall, with evidence suggesting possible animal involvement. The manner of death was listed as undetermined. Ellen Morrison, now 74, keeps a photograph of Rachel on her mantle. In the picture, Rachel is 22, smiling in hiking gear on some forgotten trail, holding her field journal, the mountains rising behind her. Ellen looks at that photograph every morning and every evening, and she tells herself that her daughter died doing what she loved, exploring the wild places, seeking understanding of the natural world. Whether that natural world included something beyond current scientific classification, whether Rachel's final moments were witnessed by David Sheridan exactly as he described, whether the truth is stranger and more unsettling than comfortable reality allows, these questions remain open. Frank Holloway keeps the case file in his office. Sometimes, late at night, he opens it and looks at the photographs of those tracks, those impossible tracks that no one ever adequately explained. He thinks about evidence and proof, about the difference between what we can prove and what we know in our bones to be true. And David Sheridan still walks the trails of the San Gabriel Mountains, still documents what he finds, still carries the weight of what he witnessed that October morning when the wilderness revealed itself to be more complex and more dangerous than maps and ranger stations suggest. The mountains remain, the mysteries endure. And somewhere in those canyons and ridges, in the quiet places where you can hear the earth breathe, something might still move through the shadows, ancient and unknowable, a reminder that wilderness is not tamed, that some questions have answers we're not prepared to accept. Rachel Morrison's story ended in those mountains. But the larger story, the question of what else walks those trails when humans are not watching, that story continues, waiting for the next person who ventures too far into the wild spaces and encounters something that shouldn't exist but does.